From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And ahead today, K-State's Terry Griffin will talk about his current cropping economics project, developing a tool for you producers to use for optimizing your cover crop selection. He'll go over the lead variables involved in that. Then, highlights from this month's Kansas Forest Service podcast, which centers on preventing wildfire damage to homes and structures in what's called the wildland-urban interface, featuring the services Chris Hanson, Dennis Carlson, Rodney Redinger, and Cassie Wandersee. And later, K-State's Charlie Lee on improving the in-water cover for fish in farm ponds. All that and more right here on Agriculture Today.
For information on threatening weather, you should depend on the National Weather Service and their broadcast on NOAA Weather Radio. NOAA Weather Radio is an all-hazards radio network that provides up-to-the-minute weather information, including life-saving warnings anytime, day or night. NOAA Weather Radio also broadcasts information on man-made disasters, such as chemical spills, amber alerts, or other national emergencies. For the National Weather Service, I'm Bill Curtis.
We're glad to have you tuned in for this Agriculture Today. On the opening segment, we'll talk cover crops, and this from the economic vantage point, and how to optimize one's cover crop production. And we'll explain what that means right now. It's something that our guest has been working on in a special project. Terry Griffin is with us. He's a cropping systems economist with K-State Research and Extension. And Terry, we want to explain what you're working with here, the economic criteria of cover crop production. Is this something that isn't earning as much attention as the agronomic side of cover crops?
I think it's brand new. We did a pretty exhaustive search, not only in Kansas, but across the Midwest and nationally, about economically optimal decision aids when it comes to selection of species used in cover crop blends. And I think it's pretty unique. There's a lot of really good agronomic understanding of what species should go into a cover crop mix, but it's pretty daunting for the land manager, whether it's the farmer, the landowner, or other players, when they go to select that optimal bundle of species to mix together for cover crop blending.
And when you say optimal or use the term optimization, the greatest economic return to this effort, is that the definition here?
So the model that I'm working on is optimized in that it's going to try to provide the least cost blend of a set of species that meets the agronomic criteria that the land manager desires. So some of the decisions that the land manager, when I say land manager, that could be the farmer, landowner, or other decision maker, they may desire a certain carbon to nitrogen ratio. And that's one of the things that the agronomists talk about when they're selecting cover crop species. And also there's some priorities. So USDA NRCS has a list of priority options that the user should be cognizant of. And depending on which priority option will lead the land manager to decide on certain species. So for instance, soil, organic matter may be the priority, or erosion control could be their priority. Another farmer may decide weed suppression is what they want to focus on. You may have ranchers that are intending to have grazing as part of it. Nitrogen fixation. The landowner may be concerned about compaction, water utilization. So the decision maker would choose what priority that they want to lean on, or which priority that they are most concerned about. And that opens up a database of which species have agronomic advantages for that priority.
That's quite a diverse set of objectives here in as far as how to attach economic value to those. Right. Is that somewhat of a difficult thing to do here?
Well, it's daunting in that even if you understand which priority that you want to focus on, you get this list of different species. And You know what carbon to nitrogen ratio each of these species provide, but it's still a very long list. And just looking at it without an economic analysis may be frustrating. And so my goal was to remove that frustration, remove the daunting aspect of trying to decide which species or species would be best for the particular land, for the particular priority that you're interested in. And so what we did was we allow the user to decide how many species do you want in your blend. Do you want just one, or do you want 2 or more, 3 or more, and so forth. And once the user, the land manager, decides the number of species that they desire, there's some other questions in there. What's the minimum amount of carbon to nitrogen ratio that you're interested in? We've got it set up to where at least 80% of the species must fit into the excellent or at least a very good rating to fit the priority option that the land manager has desired. And what we've done is minimize the cost of seed that goes into this blend. And it's analogous to ag retailers with their fertilizer blending tools that will say, what proportion of the blend will be in MAP and DAP and urea and so forth to meet the minimum criteria for that's recommended for that field to be applied. So this cover crop species tool is analogous to least cost fertilizer blending tools. Works the same way, but we're just focusing on cover crop species instead of fertilizer raw products.
There are other variables that you say you plug in here too, and one of those would be the intended planting date for that cover crop.
Exactly. So some cover crops are well suited to be planted in the fall or the spring or so forth. And these are a function of what's the main cash crop that will be grown on a particular field. And so that's also input that the user would decide. There are some really good existing tools out there today that you can tell it which priority options that you're interested in and what's your intended planting date. But the current tools only give a list of species that meet that criteria. The tool that we're working on will give a precise listing of which species fit this criteria at the minimum cost. So essentially the land manager can walk away, and when they go to the dashboard on the intranet, enter their information, hit calculate, and hit print. And when they hit print, they get an order form that they can take to their local seed provider and with what proportions of each species that they want.
Before we go any further, you did want to acknowledge that you have enlisted an agronomist or two to plug in some information here that'll make this model go.
Sure. I've been working closely, consulting with USDA, NRCS at the state level in Kansas. There are several K-State researchers. Peter Tomlinson is one of them. Gretchen Sassarath is another. And, they've done a lot of really good work on the agronomic side, and working with NRCS, I see a value to adding an economic analysis to help the decision maker, essentially reduce their frustration when it comes to choosing which species they want to include in their optimized blend.
Now, Terry, there's one variable we've not yet to specifically bring up here, and that is the price of seed itself. And have you taken representative numbers from what's out there on the market? How have you incorporated that?
Sure. So the price of each of the species is paramount. We have to get that correct in order for this model to work. And we're still working on this in development. We've done some simple surveying of the seed prices, but long term, one of the things I really want to do is link this tool in with those providers so that the seed prices are automatically updated in real time as they change at the retail level. And also, in addition to that, is the landowner, the farmer, rancher, land manager can hit order. And so the order forms go directly to their retailer instead of printing them off and taking them. So you're correct. The prices of each of the species is paramount to this model being useful.
So you are refining this tool, and it will crunch all the numbers together into answers for the producer in as far as selecting a cover crop or a mixture of cover crops for their intended purposes and their priorities. This is not yet a finished product, although getting closer, you say.
It's in the working phase. We're still looking for funding to get it pushed through to completion. We do have operational fertilizer blend tools that we intend to modify those and turn them into a interactive dashboard. And so it won't be a spreadsheet to download. It will be a website that will be listed on our websites, as well as a link to from USDA, NRCS, and so forth.
Parting thought here, though, you want producers who entertain the idea of utilizing cover crops for whatever intended purpose and priority to keep the economic side well in mind. That shouldn't be overlooked here. Optimization, as you phrase it, is highly important.
Yeah, and we get a lot of the questions is, which blend of cover crop should I use? And, as always, the answer is, well, it depends. So even if I know their intended priority, let's say they're more interested in erosion control than they are the others, and that they desire a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 20 or higher, I still need to know several things. Most of it revolves around the price of each of the species, and those are possibly changing in real time. But the biggest economic benefit here, I think, is more on the utility side than on profitability, is that if I go to a list of cover crop species and I have 15 of them that would fit my desired criteria, but I just don't know which one or more of the 15 to choose, I'm frustrated. So this tool should reduce the frustration that the land managers feel, and hopefully that will encourage the adoption of more cover crops that will aid in their long-term and short-term decisions.
Well, great work on this so far, Terry, and very much looking forward to the release of this cover crop optimization tool that hopefully will be available in the coming months. And it's a great idea for producers. We appreciate your time and talking about this with us. Take care.
Thank you, Eric. You too.
He's a cropping systems economist, K-State Research and Extension. That's Terry Griffin. And Agriculture Today will be back in a moment with more on the K-State Radio Network.
Make hand washing a healthy habit everywhere you go. Wash your hands with soap and water for at least 20 seconds, especially after going to the bathroom, before, during, and after preparing food, and before eating. If soap and water aren't available, use a hand sanitizer that has at least 60% alcohol. Life is better with clean hands. A message from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention.
Next up for you on Agriculture Today, the latest entry in a new podcast series out of the Kansas Forest Service at K-State. The podcast posted every month. This time, the spotlight is on rural wildfire management and narrowing that down even further, what can be done to ease the wildfire threat to homes and businesses that continue to emerge in rural areas in what's called the wildland-urban interface. Participating in this conversation from the KFS Wildland Fire Management team, Dennis Carlson, Chris Hanson, and Rodney Redinger, along with your moderator, Cassie Wandersee.
Let's just start off by exploring what exactly is the wildland-urban interface. So, Dennis, could you explain that one to us?
Well, basically, the wildland-urban interface is where many of our homes are now being built out more in the rural areas, because everybody wants that nice picturesque surroundings of trees and grass and all that. But one has to realize there's some things to consider when building out in these areas.
Okay, so you're talking about those picturesque trees, and why are those such an issue to build your homes right in the middle of?
Well, you kind of have to think about, as you're building these homes out there is, from a fire standpoint, what access fire department, fire trucks have to those areas. And then when you start looking at the landscape of that, of course, you're going to have a lot of grass mix, which is, fire can spread very quickly in those areas. And then the big one we got out there a lot that people really like are the eastern red cedars. And the red cedars, I mean, they're native to Kansas, but eastern red cedar can be extremely flammable. And it also, when it burns, produces a lot of embers. And those are some real, I guess, significant things we need to think about, especially when we're building homes around red cedars, how to space them and those type of things.
Chris, anything to add on to that? Any thoughts?
The wildland-urban interface for me, I always see it as Mother Nature was here first, and we're introducing ourselves into that new area. And we do need to be mindful of where we're building as far as, homes and commercial stuff too. I look out here in Kansas and comparing it to, say, a typical wildland urban interface that you would see in California, San Bernardino County, something like that. And then putting it side by side by, say, somewhere in Rooks County is a lot different. Same environment, but you just now have different assets. We have agricultural assets out here, from farming to ranching, so on. So it's very different looking, but it's still the same concept. And we need to implement how we would build our homes, build our, businesses as we're putting and plugging them into this urban interface.
Rodney.
To me, when I think of the wildland urban interface, it's where the wildland, and whether it's one home or a community of homes, where they meet. And as Chris said, it's not just homes, but businesses and other kind of assets that might be in there. But if people can take care of their own place and make each one of their places more standalone, to where the fire department doesn't have to get there and doesn't have to engage, then the fire department can focus on other priorities, like trying to stop the fire instead of trying to protect the home or whatever that looks like. And it also causes very unique challenges when we're faced with the fires in the wildland urban interface.
So what are some of those unique challenges that our fire departments across Kansas face with wildland urban interface?
Well, I think it's relatively new. We've always had farms and things like that out there that a fire department can usually protect, because you're talking about one farmstead here, and then a mile away there's the other one, and a mile away there's the other one. But then when you start getting some more of the rural development, then the newness of it, fire departments are not used to dealing with that, maybe protecting multiple homes at one time. What becomes priority, the house that's on fire or the house that's going to be on fire? And making those quick decisions is very challenging. What do you do with the people? Do you recommend they evacuate? Do you keep them in place and defend them? And those are all decisions that have to be made very, very quickly. And not to mention all just the associated hazards like propane tanks and power lines and access issues. Maybe, there's a lot of compounding things that can lead into that.
Okay, so what are you guys doing specifically to help those volunteer fire departments or local departments be better prepared for fighting wildfires in that wildland urban interface?
We work a lot with our fire departments just on a general scale, and Chris can speak a little more maybe to the specifics in his district and those kinds of things. But in a general sense, just trying to provide as much training as we can to the fire departments, getting out there and talking about our experiences, maybe, even touring some of their areas that they have concerns in. Capabilities wise, the other piece to that too is we're adding, we added some assets that we can maybe help with. Tanker 95 is the specific one that I'm referring to. And then that comes with a whole nother education piece and working with aircraft in the wildland urban interface, and which aircraft is the appropriate aircraft, and working with that. So that's kind of the general, I think, sense of where we're going and what we're doing. And like I say, Chris or Dennis can maybe speak a little bit more specifics.
I kind of agree with what Rodney was saying, is the training aspects for the fire departments and working with them. And then also what I start doing a lot more work with also is the homeowners. because they're the huge key in these areas and what they can do around their homes immediately right by their home and then out in their landscape area, what they can do around the home to protect themselves that make it much easier on the fire departments.
So what are some of those things that homeowners can do to make their homes more resilient?
Well, I mean, it's, we break it down into several zones, but, the most important zone is right around the house itself. Now, certainly, what the roof is made of, composite shingles is a better clay roof or metal, no wood shake. I don't see a lot of wood shake out anymore. I mean, there's still some. So that's where you start, and you kind of start from there and start work down the home. And then you start looking at the gutters, are they cleaned out, those type of things. And then you continue further down, looking at the landscape right up against the house. Is it just grass right up against your house? Is it rock? What's your siding made of? And just a lot of it ends up being good maintenance on your home, believe it or not. I mean, stuff you can do over a weekend.
So once we start getting back to normal and offering our full cadre of trainings, what's the best way for departments to get a hold of you guys to look at doing some of that training?
To start with, we have district fire management officers in the southwest part of the state, the northwest part of the state, and then Dennis in the kind of southeastern part of the state, and Bryce Haverkamp in the eastern part of the state. And so the best way to get a hold of us is to work through their local district fire management officer, just to start establishing that relationship. By all means, reach out to any one of us and we'll help set it up to whoever needs to go. And, as far as homeowners go, they can either get a hold of Dennis directly, or if they, are working with their fire department to set something up for a homeowner education, they can go that route as well.
Okay, if you guys could ask members of the public or homeowners, farmers, ranchers to go and do one thing to improve the resiliency of their homes or to improve that wildland-urban interface, what would it be?
Well, I kind of say this tongue-in-cheek, but a lot of it is, maintenance around your home, cleaning up. When people say, well, how much is it going to cost? Just a couple hours of work is all it's going to really cost. And even though it takes a little bit of time, that amount of time you spend can just be so beneficial in the long run.
Yeah, and if you don't want to go and do the work yourself, kind of like in my neighborhood, there's kids driving around on lawnmowers, knocking on my door 5 times a day, asking to mow my yard that's already to the dirt. So I always have them come do it. But no, I think right there with Dennis, of, just get rid of that excess fuel load, that tall, dead brush, get it out of there. Whether you got to mow it down, weed eat it, something, and, just really work on building those buffers. And, if you're starting from scratch with a new home, try to build a fire resilient landscape within that, immediate zone there. You can make some beautiful landscapes with hardscape.
And then kind of add on to Chris and Dennis there, if you don't have any ideas on what it should look like when it's done, there's a lot of references on websites that you can find.
And a person can just look up Firewise USA. There's a lot of good information on there, things that give you really good ideas.
There from the fire management team at the Kansas Forest Service at K-State, Chris Hanson, Rodney Redinger, and Dennis Carlson, along with Cassie Wandersee. Check out this latest KFS podcast in its entirety at kansasforests.org. Again, that's at kansasforests.org. And this is Agriculture Today.
When you are in need of timely, reliable, and trusted information, K-State Research and Extension is here. Whether it's organizing people, information, or resources, they have the necessary tools. Community comes first for K-State Research and Extension. For more information and to connect with your county's extension agents, visit www.ksre.k-state.edu.
You're listening to Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network, now in its 96th year of broadcast service to agriculture in Kansas and the Central Plains. Eric Atkinson with you, and with today's agricultural news headlines now, these courtesy in part of DTN. This week's Kansas Crop Progress and Condition Report from the USDA reads like this for the week ending this past Sunday. Our topsoil moisture supplies at 4% surplus, 52% adequate, and 44% short to very short. The subsoil moisture at 2% surplus, 67% adequate, 31% short to very short. Now, the condition of the Kansas winter wheat crop is slipping. 38% good to excellent now, 38% fair, 24% poor to very poor. Winter wheat jointing, 89%, and wheat headed now at 39%. That's behind the 56% for the 5-year average on this date. Corn planting in Kansas is now 61% complete. That's near the average. And emergence at 29%. Soybean planting 23% done. That's well ahead of the average of 11%. And emergence at 6% for beans. Grain sorghum planted at 5%. Range and pasture conditions 54% good to excellent, 32% fair, and 14% poor to very poor here in Kansas. For the update on corn and soybean planting progress now nationally, here's the USDA's Stephanie Ho.
The pace of corn planting is ahead of schedule.
Nationally, 67% of the crop planted, despite some slowing in recent days of the overall progress. That 67% compares to the 5-year average of 56%, but is well over twice last year's pace when just 28% of the crop was planted on that date.
USDA meteorologist Brad Rippey says corn emergence is a bigger story following a freezing cold wave.
Well, nationally, the number is 24%, slightly ahead of the 5-year average of 22% and well ahead of last year's 9%.
He says the focus this week is on states that were hardest hit by the freezes, including Minnesota, Illinois, and Indiana.
All those states largely hit by statewide freezes on May 9th and 10th, and there certainly will be an effort to watch that crop to see how much damage was done by temperatures that locally dropped well into the 20s.
The pace of soybean planting is well ahead of schedule.
Nationally, 38% of the intended acreage planted by May 10th, well ahead of the 5-year average of 23% and last year's 8%.
Rippey says more than 20% of the intended soybean crop was planted in Iowa, Michigan, Minnesota, Nebraska, and Wisconsin.
However, looking at the emergence numbers, obviously a lot fewer soybeans have emerged than corn. The national number, just 7% emerged by May 10th. That is ahead of the 5-year average of 4% and well ahead of the 1% number that was coming in this time last year.
He says emergence is an issue because of severe cold temperatures in much of the Midwest last week.
There is concern for soybeans, which tend to be less hardy with respect to freezes than corn early in the season. Some significant concern that some of that soybean crop could be lost, may need to be replanted.
This is Stephanie Ho for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
A bipartisan group of 14 senators sent a letter yesterday to the top 4 congressional leaders asking them to consider funding for the USDA that would help pork producers forced to depopulate their herds. As packing plants closed over the past month, more than 40% of pork processing capacity went with them, leading to a growing crisis of swine that have nowhere to go, the senators wrote. The USDA maintains the department does not have the authorization or funding to pay for the indemnity and costs of euthanizing healthy animals. The senators state in their letter that authorization needs to be spelled out for the USDA. And in the House, some lawmakers are calling on the president to engage the Federal Emergency Management Agency to help pay for depopulation and disposal of livestock remains. Next up, this week's edition of Milk Lines. And standing by with that, as always, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brook. Mike?
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning some things that we might do to help us survive the narrow margins that we're experiencing now and likely will continue to experience for the next several months. You know, as we look at our operations, feed cost is still 50% of what we do, so one of the issues that we're going to need to look at is, are there some ways that we can lower feed cost? So first thing I think would suggest is go take a careful inventory of the forages that you currently have on your dairy. Likely these have already been either purchased or they are farm raised. So they represent inventory that we could use in order to lower feed cost as we go forward. So some of the things that we could do is if we have enough corn silage, or maybe we're harvesting some small grain silage here this spring that'll add to that inventory, how can we use that to feed a higher level of forage in our diet and reduce the amount of concentrate, grains, and supplements that we're bringing onto the farm? That will be a way to extend our cash flow to a more positive situation as we move through the next several months. Now, you need to work with your nutritionist to carefully evaluate how you do this. There are some other things in working with the nutritionist that you could maybe also focus on. Number one, we get paid for components. So the amount of protein and fat that we're actually shipping off the farm becomes very, very important. So are there some levers there that we can pull, even though we might be decreasing the amount of milk production slightly that we get on a per cow per day basis, but we actually increase the pounds of components that we're shipping because we see increases in fat and protein percentages in the milk. A third area of opportunity to look at is how we group our cows and how are we balancing rations for those animals. For example, early lactation cows should be in probably a separate feeding group. These are the animals that we're trying to challenge to higher levels of production. Our low group, low producing animals, animals that are already pregnant, those can get by on a ration that has a much greater amount of forage, less purchased feed concentrate in it, particularly on the protein side, because we expect a lower level of milk production out of those animals. You could also consider how you're grouping heifers. If you only have a single group of heifers, do you have an opportunity to have two groups of heifers, low group and a high group? Again, you're trying to target a ration that's more likely to just meet the needs of those lower producing animals rather than a typical situation where we may have one ration that we feed across the whole dairy herd. This is Mike Brook, K-State Research and Extension, urging our dairy farmers to carefully consider how they're spending their feeding dollars as they move forward through the next few months.
All right. Many thanks, Mike. You're listening to Agriculture Today. K-State's Charlie Lee is standing by for his weekly visit next on the K-State Radio Network.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so if you have a fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going in. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Next up on Agriculture Today, K-State Research and Extension wildlife specialist Charlie Lee. He's along each Tuesday to talk wildlife management with us. You've for us today, Charlie, considerations on pond habitat for fish, and this is a crucial part of fish resource management.
Yes, fish need to have the proper habitat to do well. Habitat can be simply defined as the environment that the aquatic organisms, including fish, live in and around. They've got to have a safe, relaxing place to go that allows them to get away from predators, that allows them to spawn and reproduce. And that good fish pond habitat needs to include both shallow and deep water. It's got to provide a food source. It's got to provide hiding places, keep the smaller fish from being consumed by predator fish. And it's got to have substrate for algae, plankton, zooplankton, and other food resources to grow. So developing that pond fish habitat in deeper water and shallow water is very important if you want to maximize the use and productivity out of your farm pond.
So this sounds like it could get quite involved. Where does one start in developing that habitat then, and including all of the basic elements?
Well, keep in mind, you start by learning the habitat requirements and the preferences of the common fish that you intend to stock in your pond. You got to remember that you're going to have to manage the needs of those fish through their various life stages. and you have to manage those needs throughout the seasons of the year. The water depth, the temperature, and the water chemistry all impact your decisions about what species to stock and whether you require water aeration or whether you need to add structure or habitat into the pond, whether it's native or artificial structure. But keep in mind, most of the time, people are talking about what you can put on the pond bottom, and they may not consider the chemical, the biological, and the physical characteristics like that water depth, temperature, and oxygen content. And I get lots of calls about folks that have, for instance, particularly during the summer months, when we get hot, still weather and wind fails to agitate the water surface, the ponds then stratify into several distinct layers. And stratified ponds then become uncomfortably warm for fish near the surface, but that bottom layer is then depleted of oxygen. You get a heavy, cool water runoff that causes the pond to turn over, and you end up with a summer fish kill. Again, that is a symptom of not considering the habitat requirements and managing those habitat requirements throughout the season. So when you're building the pond, keep some of those things in mind. I realize that most of the ponds that are built here in Kansas were built to accommodate livestock watering. Unfortunately, many of them are simply basin-shaped or bowl-shaped depressions that offer very little habitat complexity. The aquatic vegetation provides most of the habitat, but pond owners then find managing those aquatic plants fairly difficult. It seems to be too many or too few to supply the needs for the fish.
So can one find a way to revamp those old cattle ponds to create that habitat necessary?
Sure, there are lots of ways to create fish habitat. We can begin with thinking of some of the things as simple as rocks or substrate that can be dropped into the pond. If the pond side slopes are steep enough, some of those will roll down towards the bottom. Some will stick on the edges. That provides a good way to introduce a place for fish to hide and for algae to grow. I like to see those rocks or those rock piles put in clusters rather than just individual rocks, because those clusters then can attract a variety of fish and provides a good medium for bacteria and other algae like string algae to flourish, which fish and the fish prey are going to feed on. Also, trees and logs. You can use just whole trees. That's great for fish habitat. They ought to be weighted down so that they don't move around into the pond in wind or ice conditions. And I like them to be almost fully submerged. So keep in mind, if you're going to use trees and logs as fish habitat in your pond, that eventually they're going to decompose, and that's going to turn into detritus that will create muck on the bottom of the pond. If you're using trees, I'm sure many people have heard of using Christmas trees as a good habitat for fish ponds. I'd prefer they use something like red cedar, which is going to last much longer, or even a very small, dense, bushy type Osage orange tree or hedge tree. Those last a long period of time in a pond and don't break down near as quickly, so you don't have to continually to add something like you do with Christmas trees, which may have to be replaced on about a 3 to 5 year cycle.
Now, to take this further, one, you say, can look at what would be called artificial types of cover that could be established in a pond.
Well, artificial cover can do the same thing for those people that want to either create their own or make their own or purchase something that they can simply drop into the pond. Oftentimes that's substrate like PVC pipe or flexible pipe, leftover garden hose, home plastic siding, all of those types of structures I've seen submerged in ponds. There's lots of information on the web of how people can build artificial substrate to add into ponds. Most of it is of a plastic type material so that it doesn't decay as quickly. But keep in mind that you also have to think about the form and function of that substrate that you're adding to the pond. Some fish like stuff that is very dense and small substrate. Others like structure that is wider, flatter, and perhaps more horizontal than vertical substrate. So those are all some considerations that pond owners should think about if they're trying to improve fish pond habitat.
Charlie, we appreciate you going over all of this today. Many thanks. Charlie Lee with us, wildlife specialist, K-State Research and Extension. Our time's away for today. Thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson here for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.